Before the neon, before the radio towers, before the polished hardwood floors and ticket windows, there was a farmhouse in Texas. A fiddle, a boy watching his father play, boot heels tapping on pine planks, neighbors drifting in from the dark. Someone's laughing in the kitchen, someone else is pushing a table back against the wall. Music, not as performance, but as life. Because out here, music wasn't something you listened to. It was something that held a community together. And that boy, James Robert Wills, would grow up to give that same feeling to an entire region. To oil towns, to ranch country, to cowboys who had ridden 100 miles for one night of light. He gave them rhythm, he gave them motion, he gave them release, and he gave them a place to belong. He made them dance. Howdy, Chip Schweiger here. Welcome to another edition of Way Out West, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the stories of the American West, brings you the very best cowboy wisdom, and celebrates the legacy of the American cowboy. Last week we rode through saddle leather. This week we step onto a wooden dance floor in the middle of an oil boom. Because the story of the West is not only about work, it's about what people did to survive that work. So today on the show, we're telling the story of Bob Wills, the man who made cowboys dance and turned oil boom towns, ranch country, and small town dance halls into the beating heart of the modern West. After the episode, check out the show notes at wayoutwestpod.com/Bob Wills. Welcome back. Before we get into Bob Wills, I want to pause for just a moment. Robert Duvall passed away this week, and for many of us, he will always be Gus McCrae in Lonesome Dove, a character who carried the West with humor, grit, and a kind of hard-earned tenderness. Men like that, even when they're fictional, shape how we understand this country and the stories we tell about it. So wherever you're listening from, consider this a quiet tip of the hat. Okay, now let's talk about the king of Western swing. The early 20th century West, trailing into the end of the cowboy era in the 1920s, wasn't the slow, sepia-toned place people like to imagine. It was loud, mechanical, restless. Oil derricks rising where longhorns had grazed only a generation earlier. Rail lines cutting through old cattle trails like steel rivers. Towns built in months, sometimes in weeks, with false front buildings, boarding houses, cafes that never seemed to close, and dance halls big enough to hold 1,000 people who had nowhere else to go. And the people in those towns, they weren't there for scenery. They were there to work. Work that started before sunrise and didn't stop when the sun went down. Work that was measured in output. Barrels, acres, heads of cattle, miles of track. Work where a man could be whole in the morning and broken by supper. And the distances between those jobs and everything that felt like home were immense. Not emotional distance, actual miles. Miles of dirt roads, miles of prairie, miles of isolation. So when Saturday night came, it wasn't just the end of a week. It was a migration. Pickup trucks and Model A Fords coming in from every direction. Cowboys who had been riding line camps, roughnecks who had been sleeping in bunkhouses, farm families who had not seen another face outside of their own in days, all moving toward one place: light, sound, people, and a bandstand. Because a culture that works that hard must have a way to come back together. It must have a place where the dust gets brushed off, where the week gets set down, where the body remembers it was made for something other than labor. Western swing became that place, and Bob Wills became the man who opened the door. In the Wills household, music was not decoration. It was responsibility. His father didn't play the fiddle for applause. He played it because dance had to happen, because neighbors had driven in from miles away and expected the room to come alive. Because in rural Texas, a good fiddler was as valuable as a good blacksmith or a good horse. Young Bob watched all of this from the edge of the room. He watched how the chairs were pushed back, how the lanterns were hung higher, how the first notes changed the air. He saw something most people miss. He saw that music created motion. A room full of tired people suddenly stood straighter. Boot heels began to mark time. Laughter came easier. Conversation started between people who had never spoken before. That was a lesson. Music wasn't sound, it was transformation. And he learned it the same way every working skill in the West was learned. Not through instruction, through immersion, through repetition, through being trusted to join in. By the time he was grown, those tunes weren't something he remembered. They were something he carried in his body, just like a roper carries the feel of a loop. The cotton fields gave him rhythm before he ever led a band. Long rows, white bowls under a punishing sun. The drag of a sack across your shoulder. Step, pull, step, pull. A tempo set by survival. That kind of work teaches you something about time. It teaches you that the human body has a natural cadence. And later, when dancers filled the floor, he would recognize that cadence instantly, because he'd lived inside of it. Then came the barbershop, and the barbershop was a crossroads. Farmers, drifters, railroad men, oil workers, black musicians traveling through town. Stories, accents, and jokes. Blues guitar licks played while someone waited for a shave. And here is where Bob Wills did something quietly revolutionary. He listened across the lines that society said were not to be crossed. He absorbed blues phrasing, jazz timing, swing rhythm. Not as imitation, but as fuel. Because if it made people move, it belonged. That instinct, that openness, is what built Western swing. Not as a style, but as a conversation between cultures on a wooden floor in Texas. Radio changed the scale of everything. Before radio, a band played for whoever could get to the dance. After radio, a band played for an entire region. A ranch house in the Panhandle, an oil camp in Oklahoma, a small cafe in a town in Kansas, all hearing the same broadcast. And when Bob Wills came over that signal, he didn't sound distant, he sounded present. In songs like San Antonio Rose, you could hear him talking to the band. You could hear him calling to the dancers. You could hear the life in the room. It was the audio version of walking through the door. And it mattered in a place where people lived so far apart. Radio made a scattered population feel like a community. And when the signal carried Bob Wills across the airwaves, people weren't just hearing a band, they were hearing themselves. Now listen to how this record begins. That smooth, almost orchestral fiddle line, this isn't front porch music anymore. This is a regional sound announcing itself at scale. A ranch house in the Panhandle, an oil camp bunkhouse in Oklahoma, a cafe in a railroad town, all tuned to the same moment. And Bob Wills became the voice that tied it all together. Tulsa wasn't just a city, it was energy. Oil money flowing through banks and into the streets. New buildings going up, cars everywhere. People arriving with ambition and leaving with stories. And Cain's Ballroom sat right in the middle of it. A vast wooden room that seemed to breathe when it filled. Cars and trucks lined up outside, dust still on the cuffs of a week's worth of work. Now this. This is not listening music. Hear that bounce in the rhythm section? That's built for motion. Boot heels on hardwood, couples turning in a long counterclockwise line. 1,000 people moving as one. Fast, urban, electric. That's Tulsa. Bob Wills didn't stand behind the music. He stood inside it in songs like Take Me Back to Tulsa. He watched the dancers the way a trail boss watches cattle. If the floor started to slow, he pushed the tempo. If the room caught fire, he stretched the song. He understood that this was not about perfection, it was about momentum. And when he threw his head back and shouted, "Aha!" that wasn't a catchphrase, it was ignition. Western swing was the first truly modern music of the rural West. It had electricity in it, literally. Amplifiers, steel guitars that could cry over the top of a crowd, drums that gave it drive, horns that connected it to the cities without losing the country. It sounded like highways, like oil pumps, like freight trains. It said that the West was not stuck in the past. It was moving forward, and it was moving forward fast. And it gave working people a soundtrack that matched their new reality. They were no longer just horsemen and farmers. They were industrial workers, mobile workers, people whose lives ran on engines and schedules. Western swing moved at that same speed. Saturday night had meaning because it had rules. You respected the dance floor, you respected your partner, you behaved in a way that carried back into the week, because everyone there would see you again. And then, near the end of the night, the tempo would settle. Listen to the feel of this. This isn't about speed, it's about holding on to that moment. One more turn around the floor, one more conversation, one more song before daylight and responsibility came back. Because for a working cowboy, for a roughneck, for a farm family, this was the only night that belonged to them. This was reputation, this was courtship, this was networking before the word even existed. A young cowboy might meet the woman he would later marry. A rancher might meet the hand he would hire, and a business deal might begin at a table along the wall between sets. It was a place where the scattered economy of the West became a society. And at the center of that society was music that made everyone feel equal for a few hours. The Texas Playboys lived the same miles their audience did. Bad roads, all-night drives, loading equipment in the cold, sleeping wherever they could, playing night after night in a different town. They weren't insulated. They were part of the same working circuit as the cowboys, oil workers, and harvest crews who followed opportunity across the map. This is why there was never a wall between a stage and a floor, because they knew the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same need for one good night. World War II pulled the heart out of every dance hall in America. Musicians enlisted, dancers enlisted, gasoline was rationed, travel became difficult. And yet the music kept going. Because when the world becomes uncertain, people reach for rhythm. They reach for something that reminds them that life still exists beyond the headlines. Bob Wills carried that responsibility, not as a celebrity, but as a working band leader who understood what those nights meant. Cowboys measure a man by whether he is real. They trusted Bob Wills because he never stopped being one of them. He talked like them, he joked like them, he worked like them. He didn't polish the edges off of the music. He left the humanity in it. And that told every man on the floor, this belongs to you. Walk into a Texas dance hall today, the architecture is the same, the movement is the same, the rhythm is the same. Couples circling counterclockwise in a long, flowing line. Boots marking time, steel guitar rising above the band. This isn't a reenactment, this is continuity. Because the working West still needs what Bob Wills gave it. A place to come together, a place to breathe, a place to remember that life is more than labor. Bob Wills did something rare. He gave a working culture its soundtrack. He made people feel seen, he made them feel included, and he made them feel alive after a week that tried to take everything out of them. This isn't just musical success. This is human success. And that is legacy. And it lives on every time the dance floor fills. Okay, before we close out for this week, we've got one more thing. Yep, that distinctive call from Buster the Bull means it's time for the Cowboy Glossary term of the week. And this week's term is punchy. So if a cowboy was called punchy, that was high praise. It meant he was the real deal, a working hand who could ride, rope, and stay with the job in bad country. The word comes from punching cattle, making your living horseback in the herd. A punchy cowboy showed up early, didn't complain, and didn't have to tell you what he could do, because his outfit already knew. And here's the best part. A lot of those same punchy hands cleaned up on a Saturday night, walked into a dance hall, and could move just as smooth across a wooden floor as they did across the range. And that's punchy. Well, that's about all for this episode of Way Out West. I appreciate you spending part of your day with me as we reflect on the king of Western swing. What Bob Wills created didn't just entertain the West, it helped hold it together. Next week on Way Out West, we climb back into the saddle and explore a bond that built the West, why a cowboy will trust a good horse with his life, and why that horse becomes more than an animal, it becomes a partner. Until next time, this is Chip Schweiger, reminding you to keep your boots dry, your saddle ready, and ride for the brand. We'll see you down the road.